The portal's inquiry is about the future and where and how it reveals itself. Central to our inquiry about the future is the appreciation of the human experience, including the nature of trauma and healing and their role in learning, development and evolution. Today we are in conversation with Alexander Beiner. Ali is a facilitator, author and podcaster. He brings an authentic next-gen leader's voice with his keen interest in cultural transformation, sense-making and new approaches to system change. Ali was the co-founder of Rebel Wisdom, an endeavor that became one of the inspirations for the Portals project. Ali, welcome.
Thank you, Aviv. And it is really good to see you again and connect. Yeah, we've had many interesting conversations in the past that weren't recorded. So I'm really looking forward to this.
And indeed, so part of what brings us today together again is that you've recently published on Substack a piece titled The Truth About Trauma, which we want to reflect on today. But even before we get to this piece, it's just great to reconnect. You and I, we've had several conversations in the high velocity phase of Rebel Wisdom, when it truly became the go-to destination and largely what shaped the sense-making and liminal web space. So I'd like to begin by asking you to reflect, what was the Rebel Wisdom experience like for you?
Yeah.
So as I imagine, 4 or 5 years that felt like 50.
Yeah, and simultaneously like a few minutes. It's very interesting, and something we talked about just briefly a second ago before recording. I'm kind of still processing that experience in a lot of ways. We wrapped up Rebel Wisdom on November 5th, 2022. It's, as we're recording right now, it's the end of January. And so, yeah, one of the things that immediately comes up for me is that something I've been sitting with that I'm most proud of is the role that we played as curators and a node in a system. And a system I think is so important, a system that brought together people interested in sense making, figuring out what's going on in the world, in systems change, in spirituality and personal growth. And that aspect of bringing together is probably what I am left with in terms of a feeling and a sensation at the end of Rebel Wisdom. I'm also, also it was wild and fast paced and sometimes chaotic, and in that sense as well, it was let's say it was a hell of a ride, and really the main reason we ended is because there was it's something beyond us in a sense. A lot of what we were doing was always feeling into the zeitgeist and then using our unique skills and perspectives to interpret, to curate, to find the most interesting rebellious thinkers out there, to help people make sense of what's going on, to help us make sense of what's going on. It was really a process of discovery. And then in some sense, that particular node and that particular approach and constellation, it was harder to tap into the zeitgeist, and that was really the feeling that we had was, okay, well, this is the time now to do different things, each of us. So overall, I'm it's interesting. In some ways, what I'm doing now is still an extension of what I was doing before, trying to make sense of what's going on. Particularly, I would say my interests are moving more towards systems change. On my book that's coming out in June is called The Bigger Picture. So really looking at that intersection between the individual and society and systems and individuals. That's really my inquiry right now. And in a way, that was always our inquiry with Rebel Wisdom, even though we had, at varying degrees, we would zoom in to things like the culture wars and something more political, and then we would zoom out to much more meta. And that was, so that process is in some ways ongoing, but for me personally, in a different way. So My short answer is I don't yet know exactly what I make of it all, and etc. And in some ways, it's still evolving and forming into something new for me personally. So yeah.
And what were some of the early formative influences and fascinations that propelled you to this convergence of personal growth, spirituality, the culture war, the zeitgeist, the becoming the translating agency for what's evolving? How do you tell in yourself the story that led you into this convergence?
Yeah, I think on a very practical level, it was the big shifts we saw politically and culturally in 2016 and 2017, where here in the UK we had Brexit, and in the US we had the election of Donald Trump. And for me and David, the other founder, both, we felt like the only people in our friend groups and networks who felt differently about what was going on. You know, for a lot of, I consider myself progressive, overall. And what was really interesting was that there was something about the progressive enterprise that was clearly not working and clearly not speaking to the majority of people, right? So there was a kind of big social and economic split happening between, let's say, a kind of metropolitan elite and everyone else. And that process also implies an inner process of shadow work, of what is it about our own worldview and how we don't want to look at. So in those early days, a lot of the energy and impulse was around this pushback to the assumptions of the progressive worldview as progressives, and some of the big influences were integral. So Ken Wilber's and others' philosophy of integral, this idea of, there's lots in it, but I would say certainly the idea that it's necessary to hold multiple perspectives at once to get a better view of reality. And the more polarized and ideological the political and cultural landscape became, the more important that seemed. So that was a huge influence. As well as, for me personally, a lot of the countercultural, psychedelic, countercultural, visionary kind of thinking that I was used to, which really gave a message that we can change systems. It is possible, and it's a question of overcoming what's known as the prosaic fallacy, which is this idea that we simply can't imagine a different way of doing things. That doesn't mean that a different way of doing things isn't possible. So that was a big influence as well. And then, many, many, many more. And I think we were riding a particular cultural wave. And then we moved from that wave into the more sort of cultural level, into the more meta, zooming out a bit to look at the bigger picture questions of systems, and people like Daniel Schmachtenberger talking about existential risk and the complexity of what we're really facing as a species. People like Ian McGilchrist looking at the way our left and right hemispheres of our brain affect culture. So that's always been my personal fascination, is why is culture the way it is? And how does culture change and evolve? And what's the relationship between the individual and culture? And those are still questions that I wrestle with pretty much every day, I think, and swing back and forth.
And part of the phenomena that developed around a Rebel Wisdom did involve the early work that David in the conversations with Jordan Peterson, and how that captured many people. So in many ways you set out to track the zeitgeist, but then at some point you became part of the zeitgeist, and there is always a capture challenge in a position like this, and I'd like you to reflect a bit about that. And because you're doing the channel and the videos and the work, but you're also building the community, and right early in the pandemic you serviced the community. So what is the learning that you distilled for yourself about this tension of when you're tracking certain teleology or conviction about what the channel and what you are there to do as the role of a storyteller of what's evolving, and then you're also finding yourself surrounded with a growing global network and they expect certain things from you and you need to begin to fulfill their projection. Talk about that experience a bit.
Yeah, that was always a tightrope walk. And, you know, it's interesting, like our initial audience on YouTube certainly was driven through, you know, David having that keen insight into this Jordan Peterson figure, and that was before he sort of exploded. So we got an initial audience of people who were really interested in questioning the assumptions of the progressive narrative that was going on, but were often quite, I would say, liberally minded themselves, not always. And really early on, very consciously, our strategy was to take that audience and introduce them to bigger frames, including especially personal growth and spirituality. And in that process, we knew that we would lose some people because it wouldn't be extreme enough for them, or it would be not political enough, etc. We also knew that we had the potential to put out lots of really simplistic, polarizing, sort of anti-woke videos, and probably we would have ended up with, instead of 250,000 subscribers, probably 2-3 million easily, because those kind of videos do very well. But you sell your soul in the process if you don't believe in that, right? So part of that was a question of what we could live with and sleep at night in terms of integrity and editorial integrity. So in some ways, it wasn't that hard a decision to make. But also the very key thing is that the way we made money was not through monetizing the content, but through creating experiences in community and running courses. And in that way, it became easier to have a kind of split between the content, which could be the content, and the experiential element, which made most of the money, so that we didn't, and of course the two were linked in some way. But what was very interesting is that actually most of our core audience ended up being the people who were much more integral in their thinking, holding multiple perspectives, interested in growing and changing and challenging their own ideas and having, you know, unique conversations, and also finding other people who wanted to do that. And that was really refreshing, because it meant that we didn't have to, you know, we couldn't have done it without the fact that people like that wanted to be involved and contribute. And so in that sense, we were quite lucky, or we positioned things well, because it meant that we didn't have to pander to the most extreme audience, which is a trap that one could fall into. It also meant, you know, we probably made, even though we sustained the business and were able to pay ourselves, you know, reasonable salaries, we probably made a tenth of the money we could have if we'd really decided to just be incredibly polarizing. But also, it wouldn't have been rebel wisdom. It would have been something else. And so in that sense, that's also something I'm proud of, is that we didn't fall into that level of audience capture, although there's always some kind of audience capture. Like, you know, it's implicit in the idea of making content or stories or ideas for people. If no one likes them at all, you have a natural thought of, okay, maybe I'm missing the mark in some way. So it's a delicate balance, I would say. Yeah.
And there is also that inherent tension that I imagine you experienced, because you were both leading men's work and courses and experiences for a while, and you have also positioned yourself not as the quote unquote the gurus who are there to teach humanity about the next whatever, but rather you brought many thought leaders and many people. So and then there were still people who gathered in the around the community who wanted you to play some kind of a leadership role, I imagine. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of inherent tension? Yeah,
that was a complex one. In a way, I think we benefited a lot from Rafi Morgan, who was a mentor to both of us and a very experienced therapist and facilitator. In a couple of ways, we both did the same counseling training that Rafia and his colleague Turia Hanover run. And really core to that is the idea and the practice of inquiry, which comes from the Ridwan or Diamond Essence tradition, which is really a kind of talking meditation. I often describe it as centered around the concept of I don't know. I mean, the whole idea of it is I don't know what's alive for me right now or what I'm noticing, and I'm going to speak into it and feel into it and follow the threads that emerge. And that's kind of, for me, that's more than a practice. It's a way of life. It's also really pretty much the scientific method in many ways, right? Like, we're core to the scientific method done well. So that's helpful because that, if done well, defends against, if that's a value embedded in a community that defends against us overly influencing in an unhealthy way the community. But at the same time, if I reflect back on it, we could have taken more of a role, a leadership role in the community, our paid community, which especially during COVID became quite active and large. And we were running 2 or 3 sessions a week, often inviting teachers in and running processes. And eventually we realized that we're not community managers, you know, and I think that was the edge of our leadership ability to figure out how to manage community. I think we both kind of felt somewhat avoidant of it and a little uncomfortable. And then also there was a sense of responsibility because, you know, if you have hundreds of people and doing processes like breath work or, you know, things that can really open things up for people, we couldn't really provide the level of care and support for someone. Like, you know, if someone had a big opening from a breath work and they got in touch, you know, we were trying to make films and write articles and run everything. And so we tried so many different ways of, you know, we had community managers, etc. And then eventually we decided to really reduce the scope and invited the core members of the community to spin off and make their own community, which is still going pretty strong, actually. It's called the Emergent Commons. People can find it. They have a Mighty Networks community, and they do all sorts of interesting practices and things there, and really went through the process together of co-creation, which is, I felt much better about in many ways because we were also a paid community. So there's this other dynamic of, you know, it's not a church, we're providing a service. And then the question is, you know, how much time can we devote to that, et cetera. So it got all very confusing and in some ways beyond our existing skill sets at that time. But I am very happy that the Emergent Commons is going strong, and they were very involved in the final Rebel Wisdom event as well. And it all felt like a nice closing and continuation.
So if you were to try to distill then for yourself the wisdom of the brief about a rapidly growing global community, and then coming through this crescendo and in a way transferring that back to people for their own co-creation, which sounds very attractive, but has many challenges by itself, because so how do you moderate it? What's the unifying principle? Is there a shared vision? Is there a shared political or value set? How do you, all that is part of the challenge of running a global community for yourself. What is like your 1 or 2 key do's and don'ts that you're taking for yourself about the future? Will you be involved again in a community endeavor like this, or is one of the conclusion is this is something I'm not going to do again?
Yeah, I mean, probably the latter. You know, I have learned a lot about myself, and while of course I love being involved in community and I love the connection of that, etc., I probably personally wouldn't create that kind of community. Because I don't think I'm the right person to, in a lot of ways. You know, I'm quite individualist. My deepest joy is in creating, writing, you know, and that whole process is very solitary often. And so the skills required to hold community, let's say at least right now, I haven't developed those skills well enough that I would feel confident to hold a large community like that. You know, certainly I run retreats and workshops in a time contained way that works. And that's actually an interesting point and something that came up for us. There's something around boundaries with community, which is obviously very, very important in many ways. But one of the boundaries is where what the community is for, and almost the duration of it. You know, I would probably want to have a time boundaried process. And for example, you know, Daniel Schmachtenberger, whose recent project is the Consilience project, they have a 5-year process. They've said this is only going to last for 5 years, and then we're going to end it no matter where we're at. There's something around that I find really interesting and healthy with community as well. And that was another thing I noticed as well, if I were to do it again, is that the parameters of what the community was for and what our shared journey was were not clear enough. And I often had the feeling, and said on community calls sometimes, you know, we need to build something, and not like something so huge that it transforms the whole world, but even if we built a chair together, you know, if we built something, the process of directing the energy felt very important. So that's another thing I would certainly go away with, is trying to figure out a way to do that.
Well, what you are framing there now is an essential element, since I've been involved with intentional communities for 40 years, many different kinds in different places around the world. There is a fundamental transition that occurs from when you say we are not a group that just come to talk about ideas, but we're actually setting ourselves to do something. And there is a project or a mission involved, and the project may be internally based, but the communities that have larger cause or emissions that involves beyond them, and like, for example, influencing the community around or the environment around them, they typically would last longer, because especially if they're able to develop an everlasting some kind of a mission that will not die within a year or 2 or 3. Born and raised in a kibbutz in Israel, they are still probably the most successful communal experience of the 20th century. Mind you, there you've had a situation where you could probably decode the success. You had people that escaped the Holocaust in Europe. They were involved in reestablishing the country of Israel, the nation of Israel. They were involved in settling the land and establishing the state. And they were involved in creating a thriving way of life, agriculturally and through various industries. So you've had unique set of imperatives that actually were there, part of the condition, even before all the progressive ideologies of the age of the early 20th century or mid 20th century. Those visions and those, they would never describe those as religions, by the way. They would describe those as ideologies. But if you go deeper into the research, many of those people, including my father, they came from religious families. So they were carrying deep religious passions, turned some before the Holocaust, some after the Holocaust, into more secular version, but in the behavioral grammar of their conduct, they were actually very religious in their portrayal and their efforts. So we are now a century later, and the question is, what will enable a community with set of ideals, visions, passions to come together and create something even more than a profound experience for a period of time? And I think it's part of the ongoing research. And it was fascinating to see you and David grappling with this inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, what a great example you just gave, which I'd love to dive into a little bit, because there's a couple of things that you mentioned, which are things that I'm currently, that we were wrestling with Rebel Wisdom, and that I'm currently wrestling with right now for a Substack feature I'm doing. But you mentioned there's these two elements there that I found interesting. On the one hand, with the kibbutzes, there's a sort of shared environmental or political constraints that bind and change or kind of affect the success. And then you also mentioned the religious side of it, which is the sacred, which is something that's higher than, it's a kind of, the sacred in some schools of sociology is defined as what is beyond us, anything beyond the social game, and of course the sacred is also the deep mystery of being. And that's it's a very interesting question right now.
It's more than two. It's more than two factors. It's probably 3 or 4 or 5 factors. So, number one, there are a large group of people escaping Europe. So there is existential imperative number one. They are now coming to a land that needs to be reliberated and rediscovered. And there is an existential imperative number two of actually establishing the country. So you've got these two unique existential threats, imperatives that are larger than any one person in any circle. Then you bring into it the social, ideological impulse of the time that you can actually track in some way to late 19th century, arising through the early 20th century in the mid-Europe German culture and more some of the idealist philosophies, and the youth movement that emerged at the time that had this construct of today at this stage in the game, 21st century, we call it social construction. They did not know about social construction, but they were very interested in, they used to talk about creating the new man. We will today talk about it in a whole other way. So there was an ideological impulse. That's factor 3. Factor 4 is that largely unbeknown to them is fueling and channeling and releasing some of the Jewish religious diaspora and containment for centuries in Europe, and the promise of the Holy Land and recreating Jerusalem. So that energy that's locked for generations is being released. And the 5th factor I'll mention, this is me going a little bit esoteric, is the essence that lives in the land, the essence that lives in the Holy Land, that in a way has a covenantal nature with the Jewish people. And you see, how do you know, what is the premise, what gives me the authority to describe it in this way, Ali, is, so they come together in early communities, and what do? They work very hard all day long physically, because they're working in the fields and all that. What do they do when they come in the evening to alleviate the pain and the suffering and the struggle? They sing and they dance. And so they liberate a certain ecstatic experience without them calling it, we are now practicing ecstatic behavior. See, all of it is being unlocked without them being methodological about it. It's their discovering what in other places in the world, even in the East and so on, communities will practice as these are unique modalities, let's develop them. They are more discovering this by just a sheer struggle and search. And so they do 2 things in the evening. They do the singing and dancing, and they do this their early self-inquiry work, where they are discovering relational spaces. They sit in circles and have these conversations, and they will not talk about it like you and I will talk about it into the 21st century of discovering the field of collective presence. But they actually experience something like that, and they're into their 20s, and you bet that there are hormones all over the place, so there is that dimension as well. And all of it is occurring in the crucible of huge, big cultural, social event of establishing the State of Israel. So you've got a crucible of these 5 vectors creating probably a once in a whatever social experiment. And this is why, for a very long time, if you look in Israel in terms of success of industrial output, the kibbutz movement proportionally higher than the percentage in the community. If especially you look the special commando units, the Air Force where I was trained, right, the fighter pilots, the percentages of the people coming from the kibbutz movement is like at some point the kibbutz movement represents just 3 or 4 or 5% of the population, and you have in some of those elite units like 20 or 25% coming from that background. So that pioneering spirit of we can create something unique and we can shape our destiny is partly flowing in the bloodstream and the veins of that next generation that shaped the country so very much.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Yeah, thank you for illuminating that a bit. I mean, what's striking to me from that, when you list those factors, is including sort of there's a shared identity, there's a sacred intention, there's a shared connection to the land and the importance of the land. It's based on place. You talked about like embodiment and communitas. So many of those factors are very difficult to do in a globalized online community, right? It's so hard. This is, there's a lot of people around the world who want to find others and find ways to apply their skills to moving into a new reality and a new paradigm, whether that's game B, figuring out how to get past the rivalrous winner takes all dynamics of capitalism, or whether it's, there's lots of different systems change communities. And one of the difficult aspects of that is that it's very difficult to get people in the same place, where when you do, you can have that sense of deep connection and communitas, but usually they leave and go back to their own countries or wherever they are. You can also create real deep connections and collaborations online as absolutely possible. But there's also always this missing piece of the shared metaphysics, something really deep about what matters and what reality is. And there's an interesting book by Tara Isabella Burton called Strange Rites, which is around the way religion is being expressed in the 21st century. And she points to the rise of spiritual but not religious, which is effectively, she argues that it's a process of people remixing different spiritual and religious traditions to the one they want, which, fine. But what that means is very difficult to have a shared reality with others, a shared religious, spiritual reality with others. We have this plethora of different expressions, and yet there isn't a meta story or focus or sacred intention to bind it together. And I think that is the most important thing. I think that alone could compensate for some of the other missing pieces. And that's what I'm really interested in is finding ways that we can access that. I call it the minimum viable shared reality.
Yeah.
What's that?
Well, we could spend a whole episode just on that, because I could then describe to you, first of all, the other important lessons, teachable lessons from the kibbutz experience to the game B communities and endeavors, and to various integral endeavors. I could also map for you the pathologies of the kibbutz and why, most critically, it never managed to update itself through the 60s, 70s, 80s of the 20th century. So you are now describing communal endeavors inside a postmodern / metamodern context. They arose right at the beginning, just at the threshold of postmodernity, if you like, through more early 20th century. You have Maslow and Jung and yeah, you do have Rogerian school in the US. And so there is something that's arising about collectives in a new way through the mid-20th century. But the kibbutz was able to succeed because it faced existential threat and was part of a larger movement than itself. Most of the current endeavors that you find some people who are driven by some aspirational, visionary, spiritual, metaphysical impulse, they are missing a way to bring people together. Number one, inside, how do you weave that, the higher ideal, with the living reality of day to day, including, by the way, building families and building industries and supporting ourselves financially and so on, because navel gazing and talking about doing our shadow work is not a way to support a community, right? So there is a lot to unpack there. The reason we enter this is because what was so unique about Rebel Wisdom, again, you were able to capture for a moment in time in this 2017, 2018, 2019 to the early pandemic, you were able to capture the zeitgeist. And I'm just before we transition to focus on trauma, what is the other insight or learning for you about that, about tracking where the culture is and finding a way to hit the chord that translates something of the time? And where else do you see that it's being done in terms of leading this process? So I just threw half a dozen different questions at you to see what would you want to pick and play with?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first part of that is, on a very practical level, patience, because it's a process of deep listening rather than it's both passive and active. But certainly the first part of tapping into the zeitgeist is listening and being curious. And but of course you might listen to be curious and want to figure out, what's really shifting, what's happening, what's emerging as nothing, And so part of the process is, uncertainty tolerance and also complexity tolerance, and just being totally willing that you never figure it out. And that you're not going to ever have anything else interesting to say about the zeitgeist at all. That's part of what the attitude I try my best to hold. It's like, okay, well, if it's there, it's there. And I think then I'm also a big believer in a model of innovation called strategic intuition, which is created by William Duggan at, I think, Stanford or Columbia. And that process involves having this 4-stage process, where the first stage is having examples from history. So really knowing your stuff, really reading everything, absorbing things, having this database of different ideas, articles, and also lateral, like watching films outside of your bubble. If you're really into meta stuff, watch some reality TV, it's just really getting out of your comfort zone. And then there's the presence of mind, which is the letting go of trying to figure it out. And then the next stage is the eureka moment of, a new combination of existing elements has been combined in my unconscious and it's shot into my conscious mind. And that is pretty much how for me personally, how every good piece of insight or content that I've done has come about in some version of that, sometimes more dramatic than others. It really depends. Sometimes for me personally, it happens with, because I write mainly, I get a title for an article. And I had one with watching the new Lord of the Rings. I was just, walking around and I had the line, Nazi elves and Cockney orcs. And I thought, that's cool. What a cool title. I want to write something about that. I don't entirely know. It was really about the class dynamics that show up in Lord of the Rings. But what came first was the title. And what usually comes first is this like kind of moment of insight. And, I think a lot of people who track the zeitgeist share that, as far as I know and have spoken to people, there's a sense of a hunch, like there is in any field. Scientists have the same thing. Everyone has that. It's just like, there's something there, but I don't know what it is. And the joy of unraveling and unpicking that. So, and then the fourth stage of that particular process is the resolution to carry it through, because you're going to feel self-doubt and uncertainty. And if it's a genuinely interesting new idea or new framing on an old idea, somebody's going to say, oh, that's crap. What are you talking about? Right. And you have to be willing to withstand that, which I still find very difficult. I find that I gave a talk in Exeter University a few days ago. And I didn't realize just how qualified some of the audience were going to be. And one was a neuroscientist whose work I read when I was 19, and she was on the Zoom part of the audience. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's going to ask me a question when I'm arguing metaphysics and idealism and physics, So in that sense, there's that sense of, okay, do I know my stuff really, you know? And that was an inquiry I went on after that. I was like, okay, I think in that particular way, I need to know my stuff to answer those particular questions a bit better, right? So it's a complex process. Yeah, so I think there's that's the process I think practically works. And then I think probably another very important aspect is just humility and openness, because like we're surfing the culture, like we're riding the wave, we're not making the wave. And of course we are making the wave at the same time, all of us together, right? But there's a sense of, as an individual hold on in the whole system, ultimately it's about, again, back to what I started with, kind of a deep listening and figuring out like what's really going on. Yeah.
Well, so let's move to the trauma conversation, and let me use this segue you offered there about the intuition that guides you to a new piece and insight. What was it that made you write this piece that you titled The Truth About Trauma?
Yeah, it was actually very similar to the process I just described, in that I had a hunch that I think a lot of people who are involved in therapy or coaching or personal growth or lots of different areas have this kind of hunch of there's something all encompassing about the narrative that's developed around trauma, right? It's everywhere. And that always makes me suspicious. And I think anyone with a sort of journalistic mindset is always suspicious of anything that's too popular. You know? So I had this kind of suspicion, and you know, I had been trained in a trauma-informed counseling approach, and so I also recognized the value of it too, you know. And we had on Rebel Wisdom a lot of the key figures in trauma, you know, Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, but also when I looked at you know, a couple times I looked at the science and the papers and the peer review behind it, and I was like, well, yeah, these are really just theories still, and they're very popular, but that's so interesting that they're not that solid as theories scientifically in our current model. I'm not saying they're not actually, I'm just saying that, you know, compared to some other things, and yet they're so popular. And I'm in workshops and elsewhere, and trauma just seems to be coming up. But it's not just individual trauma, it's collective trauma, ancestral trauma, there's trauma bonding, there's all the trauma is everywhere, right?
Yeah, here is actually the way you wrote it at the opening. You say, trauma is absolutely everywhere in popular culture today. We talk about the collective trauma, ancestral trauma, acute trauma, complex trauma, attachment trauma, trauma bonding, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and trauma dumping. And you say trauma is historic, personal, universal. Above all, trauma is not what it appears to be. So this is where I'm asking, so what do you mean by that? What led you to frame that articulation?
Yeah, so it was actually quite a long a process I went on, and the instigating factor in me wanting to write something about it, or actually originally make a film about it, was the idea, was a piece I read by Parul Sehgal, who's a literary critic. It was in the New Yorker, and her piece is called "The Case Against the Trauma Plot." And I thought, aha, interesting. What she's arguing is effectively that a lot of writers of modern stories are using trauma to explain their characters, you know. They do what they do because of the trauma they experienced. And her argument was that oversimplifies them and takes the mystery out of them. And, you know, I didn't put it in the article, but she gave a great example of someone has rewritten Hamlet to give him a childhood trauma so that he explains his behavior through the rest of the play, which completely takes away the magic of Hamlet. You know, it really just, part of the point is the mystery of what he's doing and why. You know, is he crazy? Is he not? Etc. So I was really struck by that article. And in the article, she mentioned a professor at Columbia University called George Bonanno, who had just published a book called The End of Trauma. And what was fascinating and really synchronous is that one of our longtime members in Rebel Wisdom, this was almost this time last year, it was quite a while ago, he wrote to us the very next day and said that he used to go to Columbia. he's good friends with George Bonanno, and he really thinks we should have him on the podcast. We should have him on Rebelism. And I thought, this is crazy. Like, yeah, definitely. So I read the book, The End of Trauma, and I got in touch with George. And then I thought, okay, there's a couple of things, right, about trauma that I started to learn. Firstly, clinicians aren't talking about the same thing when they say trauma. And this became very clear talking to Bonanno, because for him, trauma is shock trauma, like being in a car accident or being assaulted, whatever it might be.
An acute event of a specific incident.
And in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry, it's a specific event followed by a range of different possible symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, social isolation, etc. In fact, there's so many that I also didn't put this in the article, but there's so many potential symptoms that I think it's like 1.5 million potential combinations of ways you could have an acute trauma, and then showing up, you could have PTSD. And it actually took quite a while to get PTSD into the DSM, so that was quite an achievement. But now, trauma is also used to describe the experience that people have of, say, childhood neglect and abuse. So, which is traumatic, but it's over an extended period. Or say, dealing with a narcissist or a sociopath, where it's small things over time, or it's that you didn't get what you needed as a child. There's lots of different ways to describe that. And that's also described as trauma. The problem is people like Bonanno, they don't see that as trauma. He's like, that's not a trauma. And also what became, well, actually, I'll get to that in a moment. I also spoke to Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps a Score, which is a tremendously successful book, which argues that even if we're not aware of trauma mentally in ourselves, it's recorded in the body. So it's in there, and until our nervous system can express what it needed to express in the moment, whether that's running away or fighting, whatever it might be, it will stay there. And it's a very body first approach to mental health. So it's saying like, no, it's not all in the mind. Your body keeps a score of these things and it comes out. Now, I think there's truth to all of these modalities, but what was fascinating to me through the process of researching it was the fact that someone like George Bonanno, who's been researching trauma for 30 years, and someone like Bessel van der Kolk, who's been researching trauma for 30 years, could disagree with each other so intensely that they just think the other one is crazy, almost, right? It's a real academic hotspot. And so part of the reason is because complex trauma, as it's sometimes called, as in childhood neglect or abuse, which leads to lots of different responses like addiction, for example, or difficulty maintaining relationships. That is certainly very well supported in evidence. If you've had it, and we know this intuitively, if you've had a bad, abusive, horrible childhood where you didn't feel loved, it's much more likely that you're going to struggle later in life. So that is called very often, well, complex trauma is one word, but Bonanno's example is really interesting because he's saying, look, we get over traumas. We have a car crash, we go through a process, and then we're actually, and everyone said this, Bessel van der Kolk and Bonanno and Rachel Yehuda, who I interviewed, there's another really accomplished trauma researcher and clinician. It's like, we're pretty good at dealing with shock trauma, right? We're pretty good. If someone's gone through an assault, etc., we know how to do that quite well. We're not so great at dealing with the complexity of someone who had, for example, childhood neglect. So that brought me to, so firstly,
let me just hold you there to rethread and map perhaps three conundrums or three tensions that you so far described. One is the recognition that there are different categories of experiences. One is the acute event that is a shock event versus an event that is more carrying over a longer period of time and has a cyclical or persisting nature to it. So the tension there is we're using the same word to describe two different experience origins. So that's one tension you unearthed, and you said, is there a way to redefine or come up with a new word or separate them? So that's issue one. Issue two is, where is the trauma registered? Is it a mental? Is it a brain phenomenon? Is it in the body? Is it down to the cellular? And those different perspectives of where do we register the trauma shapes some of the healing and therapy modalities. Do we heal through the body? Do we heal through the mind? Do we bring it together? Do we heal you, the person, individually? Do we need to take you to the environment, the place where it happened? Do we need to take you to be with people that associated? All of those conundrums of where is the trauma registered, and therefore how to best address it. And then there is the third inquiry that's a thread through your entire piece, which is you're saying, well, hold on a minute, have we actually just picked up this story as an alibi or as a social excuse, almost adopting a, whatever you'd call it, I don't think you use this word, but you could say a Freudian transmission through the ages, transmitted into the 21st century. We now have we have developed as a culture the myth of trauma to exonerate us, to give us permission to tell all our stories inside this greater context. So these are the three pieces that I heard you so far map as you were researching and internalizing all these conversations with those experts.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd like to talk about that third piece, because that was probably the thing I found most interesting and what I found was most exciting to me. And that came actually through writing the piece or thinking about writing it, because I actually recorded the interviews a while ago. And then we decided to, well, first I got my book deal and I had to write a book in 6 months. And then we decided to end Rebel Wisdom. And we were going to maybe do it at the end of the summer, but it got very busy. And so I actually, it took quite a while, but it was good because I had a lot of time to kind of reflect. And on that third piece, that idea of trauma as a cultural story got me thinking about the way that trauma, well, firstly, psychotherapy in the West, in many parts of the West, has come to fill the whole of religion. And Tom Zatz, who is a kind of real critic of the whole psychotherapeutic endeavor, he argues that, psychotherapy isn't really a science. It's much more like a religious care process, right? It's where you're basically going to someone who is giving you advice about how to live your life. And even though many therapists don't do that, right? They're very much like a blank slate, and they're very aware of that. There is some sense of, there's something like going to the priest. There's something confessional about it. There's something that is holding a role that religion used to play. And so the big idea that I got excited about was, well, let's say psychotherapy is a religion, or we could see it as that, then it needs to have an answer to the problem of evil, which is the question of, why do bad things happen, right? If all is one, or if God is all loving and all omnipotent, why did bad things happen, right? This is known as the problem of evil in theology, and each religion has different process of trying to make sense of that. But what each religion needs is some way of explaining why we suffer, right? And so what psychotherapy needs, if it's holding the place of religion, even unconsciously, is some understanding of some way to frame suffering. And I think trauma has become that way. And in many ways, it's almost a shamanic process of going in and finding and this might be because it's true, this is how we heal, this is how we heal shamanically, is going in and finding that part of ourselves that has been wounded and reframing it, reconnecting with it, and transforming it into something new. And that there's something very important and beautiful about that. But the thing that I found most interesting on the sociological level is that when that becomes a cultural story, what happens is that we end up becoming, I think, less resilient as a culture, because we see trauma everywhere. We understand our suffering through trauma, which is this kind of very vague term we don't quite know how to define. And what is often forgotten is the role of resilience, which is George Bonanno's argument in The End of Trauma. What's also happens is that the idea of bad things happening to us that we struggle with, which is just life, and trauma get merged together, particularly with Generation Z. And so that means that you get the growth that comes from just living life and struggling and having relationships that didn't go well and not getting your needs met or goals met. All of that suddenly becomes externalized into this hazy, almost like Satan. Well, Satan did it. Trauma did it, right? And how do you do that? We have to exercise it in some way and kind of purge yourself from it. So I think in many ways, trauma is becoming that for secular societies.
Yeah, this is a fascinating insight you're truly describing there. You're saying psychotherapy potentially answering the social void created by the disappearing role of religion. So the psychotherapist becoming the minister. Inside it, there is still the big inquiry, the big conundrum. So why specifically are we seeing this in the context of this generation? Is there a significance? Is there a generational abdication here? And the use of trauma as an alibi? And because again, looking back at generation of my father, people that escaped Europe in World War II, they suffered enormously, but they never talked about trauma. So now there is an interesting conundrum to run right in parallel to what you framed. It could this be a new religion in the absence of religion, which is, well, are we just all becoming new generations becoming more delicate and more sensitive and not as resilient, and it's a generation that truly needs a stoic awakening to confront life? Is that what this is about? And or is there something else about our fascination with the interior that you can map to mid-20th century, right? And right when postmodernity arises, there is in parallel, these are like two separate movements, but they occur around the same time. We become fascinated with our interior. I used to say that my father's generation, they had the light turn up outside of them, so they responded to external missions. The generation just before me, the light was on in the balcony. They kind of looked inside, but not really. I am probably a little further advanced than my age group, but certainly as it comes to your generation and so on, we became very interested in turning the light on the inside. So here is a contemplative inquiry to put right in parallel to what you are framing, which is, could it be that us getting interested with the interior and bringing the interior online and therefore accessing sensitivities that were not there, not necessarily available in the same way, that is part of the issue? It's not that we are less resilient, but it's that a part of the human that was dormant was now coming online because the universe at large now needed more of the human coming online. We are not interested just in buildings and churches and cathedrals we can build of stone. We are more interested in the cathedral we can build on the inside, which means turning the lights on the inside. And therefore we will need to become more sensitive. But in the process of that, we are still going through the pathologies of highly sensitizing, not necessarily always the most constructive, healthy, robust side of ourselves. So I will just frame that as a nearby metaphysical, spiritual, developmental inquiry and contemplation next to the story of psychotherapy as a new religion.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'd like to pick up on that because I think, and this is something I was thinking about writing the piece, overall, the capacity to express to another the pain you're going through internally is a very healthy and important thing. And, and I'm the nuance I think with it is that I think what shifted the most is the role that expressing your internality to others now plays. Because, for example, you know, I'm 35, so I'm just at the cusp of the millennial generation that didn't grow up with the internet until sort of being a bit later, you know, certainly not social media. You know, it kind of came in more when I was like a mid-teenager, and then in university, Facebook launched.
You're pre what they call digital natives.
Exactly. I probably am fairly digital native, but not the same as like it wasn't around when I was a child and in the kind of those years. And I noticed quite a difference in, I went to a high school reunion years ago, and our teacher said, a little bit drunk as we're all out, he was like, oh, you know, you're a year and maybe 2 years before you were the most fun to teach, and it's just not been as fun since then. And we were like, oh, why is that? He's like, because a lot of you were nonconformist, you were in bands, you were doing stuff, you were kind of, you know, it was very creative and expressive. And then what happened when social media came is that there was a great conformity that happened, right? And so that's because everyone's worried about anything I do might be filmed and put on social media. And there's that whole aspect. At the same time, there is a status gaining process for teenagers in how you express your internality. It's becoming, and you have celebrities like, you know, Selena Gomez, and others who have really now stepping into their vulnerability. It's a very complex thing, because on the one hand, it's very healthy. On the other hand, it's slightly narcissistic, because it creates vulnerability as status. You know,
right? So how do you decode that? What do you read that to metaphysically describe about the human, the human person, the humanity person of this time?
Well, I think to touch on an earlier thing you said, I think what's needed is sort of somewhat of a stoic revolution. I think it needs about a 50% stoic resolution while keeping that vulnerability and that openness. And the other thing I would point out, which I think is useful, is that are you familiar with the work of Joseph Henrich, who wrote The Weirdest People in the World?
I've seen your conversation or write-up about it a couple of years ago, yes.
He's really interesting. He and others have done a lot of psychological research on the Western psyche, let's say. And WEIRD stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And one of the qualities that weird people have is an intense focus on internality and an intense need to understand the internal world of another person. Because we don't have, like, think of a job interview. A job interview in a culture that is as more sort of kin obligations might be like, oh, well, you know, it's a cousin of a cousin, and, you know, there's shame involved if they mess up, and there's a whole network where the social game is going to be bad for them if they mess up. So there's a bit of, you know, people are more known quantities a little bit, right? But in, you know, since certainly the kind of maybe 1400s, even earlier in the West, you know, imagine you're a Geneva clockmaker, and it's the 1450s, and some young guy comes in and says, I want to be an apprentice. It's like, well, I don't know him. Who is he? You know, I don't know his family. He's, you know, what really matters is, can I trust him as a person? Is he going to be on time? Is he going to steal any of the watches, etc.? So now I need to really get the measure of that person. Like, who are they really? Like, what are they like? And he argues that has become very embedded in our whole cultural operating system. And so I think but at the same time, to your point, like, you know, both of my grandfathers who fought on different sides of the Second World War, neither of them really spoke about what happened. One of them drank a lot, you know, that was his, you know, and so the other flip side of not having that vulnerability and that awareness of trauma is a lot of abuse, a lot of stunted growth, you know, and so, you know, the show Mad Men is a great example. You know, they're drinking whiskey from like 9 o'clock in the morning, and So I find that it's potent for us to bring into this contemplation the evolutionary framework, whereby you view yourself, you imagine yourself to forever be birthing a new babushka, and you Ali on the inside, and when that one reveals itself, there is another. You're forever midwifing your next new version of yourself. And if you follow that idea as part of the evolutionary story of life,
and what is now being unlocked in humans, that will mean that we've got to become very interested in ourselves. This is where your distinction about a healthy, constructive, positive self-introspection versus one that is narcissistic and is somewhat destructive, that distinction is very important, because they may sound similar in the first place, but they actually have a very different outcome. So I am seeing that potentially the usage of trauma, as you said, as a replacement of evil in Western religions, because in Eastern religions, suffering was mapped in a slightly different way and addressed in a different way. But in Western religions, that place of trauma is, perhaps we could, time will tell, but we could position it as an initiatory dimension of being invited, being permitted to access the fuller, greater potential within, and needing to grow through this story. This is where telling what you're telling in this article and saying, hey, really, do we truly want to ground the entirety of our story as forever resourced and retethered to trauma? Is it really the most constructive way to see and tell our life story? That remains to be something to be developed.
Yeah, a new thought just came to me from what you said, and it's related to this idea of an evolutionary process, right? Because I think you made a really good point of, you know, we could see this, and I kind of do, as a natural evolutionary process that's at its early stages, whereby culture becomes more emotionally aware, and that's overall a good thing. And of course, it goes excessive to begin with. But you know, you mentioned the Eastern traditions, and I think one of the most powerful things about, well, Christianity and Buddhism, and yeah, you know, I'll use those two traditions, is that suffering is given the center point, right? And I think even in Judaism, the history is one of great suffering, right? There's a sense of, in both Eastern and Abrahamic religions, that suffering is pretty central. And I think there's something very healthy about starting with the baseline of life as suffering and then moving up from that, rather than, I think, the sort of modern Western consumerist notion of life should be the pursuit of happiness and not suffering. And if suffering happens, that's something that's getting in your way of the cultural mission, which is to pursue happiness, let's say. And I think there's maybe something, what that makes me wonder is whether this over fascination with trauma could be a natural recalibration towards putting suffering at the center of the cultural story. At the same time, it's missing the transcendence that we get from religion, which goes, life is suffering, and here's how to transmute that suffering into something else. Because with the trauma narrative, there's post-traumatic growth, but it's underexpressed and it's not as big a part of the narrative. Hopefully it will be, but it's not really, you hear far fewer stories if you go on TikTok and type in trauma of this thing happened to me and I overcame it and I changed as a person, which, by the way, is what all of our stories about in every culture, right? Instead, it's this thing happened to me and I want sympathy for it, or I want attention for it. Right. And this is not to say that that's the case when really horrible things have happened to people and they need to express it because it helps their process. Different things. It's much more like when a teenager says, my dad didn't pick me up from school on time and now I'm traumatized. It's like, no, you're not traumatized. It just a thing happened to you they didn't like, you know? So it's a difference.
What have you learned from the people you spoke to about how they are codifying resilience and the way to boost resilience? This is a space that I've done quite a bit of work in organizational coaching and consulting and work that I've developed. I'm curious, what have they described? So in one of the pieces in your write-up, there is a paragraph where one of the people you spoke to identify the importance of being able to indeed describe and talk about your experience and access that in your body, and being able to source that as part of the healing. And and a way to engender resilience. But what else have you found about resilience through these conversations?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. That was Bessel van der Kolk talking about that, and I think that's actually very, very true, and a really big part of me processing certainly my pain is that being able to describe it, being able to go into it. What was very interesting was, Rachel Yehuda talked about seeing it as a process that you're going into and coming out the other side, right? Change. So there's a kind of self-narration that goes along with it, which I think is very important. What's a story that you are telling about yourself? George Bonanno has probably done the most research on resilience. And his argument is that resilience is very closely tied and incredibly linked to flexibility. So cognitive flexibility is the ability to think of alternatives, to be fluid, to improvise, to be flexible in your thinking. Like a deep depression is the opposite of cognitive flexibility. It's just our frames are very tight and narrow. We can't get out of them. And so for him, when he talks about, well, how do people who successfully go through their trauma, what seems to be the common factor? It's that they're fluid with their own healing process, and they go, okay, I did this talking therapy, didn't really work. Okay, now I try yoga. Something about in the body is really shifting. There's something good about that. I went back to the place it happened. Oh, that was scary, but there's something in that too. And maybe I try in a little bit of a different way. Maybe I'll go with a friend next time. All of this fluidity, and that's an attitude thing, right? There's this particular attitude. And, part of that comes through the genetic temperament you're born with. Part of it comes through your education. Part of it comes through your spiritual practice. So I think then the interesting question becomes, how can we empower everyone to be more flexible in the way that they think and experience? Because everyone has the capacity. It's just a question of probably finding the right way in for different thought styles, let's say, and different temperaments.
Well, so it's interesting that what he's describing as cognitive flexibility very much builds on the understanding of brain plasticity. The fact that when I was a child, we were told that your brain cells stop growing at 20 or something. And when I was 20, that fact already changed, because there was the early discoveries that actually no, brain plasticity was a real phenomenon there, by which there was the realization that you can actually create new synaptic connections and build new circuitries through learning, through practice, through exposing yourself to new experiences, and so on and so forth. In the aftermath of 2008, the financial crisis, I was already deeply in consulting and coaching work. I realized that resilience was going to be a big thing for the coming decade. So I gathered a circle of friends, psychologists, practitioners, and we spent 2 years working on the project of resilience. And the 5 key ideas we codified, and then it became a tool that I've been using for the last 15 years now with all the teams I've worked with. The first idea that we codified was that we reframed resilience from bouncing back to bouncing forward. So the construct of bouncing back means you imagine that you're going to be able to re-establish the old balance. And the recovery and the restoration will be in the same equilibrium before the point of collapse. Whereas bouncing forward suggested no. These are emergent living systems. You will never be able to reestablish the balance that was there. You're going to heal and find optimal performance into a whole new equilibrium. So that was idea 1, big reframe from
that, by the way. I think that's a very good framing. Yeah.
Yeah. The second idea was that we realized, which you already noted, that really when we look at resilience, it's not a one thing. It's a compound, multiple outcomes shaped by multiple inputs, shaped by experience, upbringing, belief systems, DNA, growth mindset, chosen mindset, social setting, environment, the whole lot. All those are inputs, and they create multiple outcomes. So that was the second idea about resilience. Don't look at a simple formula of one factor on two sides, multiple inputs, multiple outcomes. The third idea was that we codified resilience as a skill. And the skill is made out of a set of practices. And the very important definition in that was to come to teams and people I've worked with and say, look, you're going to be able to do your resilience score today, but it's not fixed. You can work on specific capacities and capabilities, such as get yourself into some stoic training, and you're going to be able to respond differently next time. So resilience as a skill and as a teachable modality. The fourth thing we did, which was the main piece of the work, we actually codified 5 pillars of resilience. So physical resilience, mental resilience, emotional resilience, social resilience, and spiritual resilience. And in each of those 5, we codified 5 main behaviors or traits. And so it was developed actually as a tool that you could self-evaluate. And then the last thing was that we developed specific strategies to boost your resilience. So physical, like pretty obvious. How do you do with your rest and repair practices? What is it you do to take care of yourself physically so you are in a better, more fit condition to face any challenge, all the way to mental, social, spiritual. It's very interesting when we do the score, and I work mostly with executive teams. You can guess many of them are the type that when they go through that questionnaire, they say, you know, the lowest point is asking for help. That's part of social resilience. Do I build a network of people around me? Am I relaxed and easy to ask for help? These are some of the behavioral measures or skills that will shape social resilience. And as they go through this, they begin to see the interpenetrating nature of this. Because if you're physically robust and strong, it will help you mentally, spiritually, in every other way. If your social network is robust, that is where you will be able to source tremendous amount of resilience. So plenty of rich discovery there. And what was fascinating for me in reading your piece is that I felt, okay, so we have to get as big as we can on resilience as much as we are on trauma, but at least at the moment, there is something so capturing to the collective psyche, especially as you landed the article with, again, tracing back to ancestral and collective trauma, which is even better because I can tell a story about myself, not just based on my own experience, but on the larger social experience. So some thoughts from you about those threads.
Well, firstly, it's fascinating to see how much the model you developed overlaps with what Beiner came up with researching trauma and resilience. And there's so many really important factors that I really enjoyed hearing about that. And one of the immediate thing that comes up for me is something we haven't quite touched on yet, but it's kind of implicit in the whole conversation about, why I wanted to write the piece, is that it's very important culturally what our cultural story is about ourselves. And if we have a story about ourselves that we're inherently fragile, then we have a particular type of culture, which I think it prevents innovation and creativity and risk-taking. And we need all those things to come through the meta crisis that we're all facing. If we have a culture that says, we are inherently resilient, sometimes life gets the better of us and we need support and love to get through that. And some of us are more resilient than others, but that's not because they're inherently better. It's because of all the factors you just mentioned and probably 1,000 more. It's multipolar, right? It's all kind of feeding in. Take the stigma out of not being resilient, but also strive for resilience. That feels to me like a much healthier culture that can meet the challenge of these times, right? And so probably for the same reason you started focusing on resilience, that's why I'm interested in it too. What's also, I think, important is that going back to neuroplasticity, a lot of the research on neuroplasticity that I have read, and it's decent amount, I'm not a neuroscientist though, so I put that caveat up front, suggests that neuroplasticity might be caused primarily, or certainly helped a lot, by strain on the organism, challenge. So when we're under challenge and strain and survival pressure, neuroplasticity goes into overdrive, because we go, okay, we need new ideas, right? We need new ways of seeing, we need new connections. What's happening? The way we're being isn't working. And so pressure on the organism is important. And if we have a cultural story that pain and pressure is to be avoided, because God forbid we become traumatized and we need safe spaces and no one's to ever feel uncomfortable, then how are we going to have our healthy neuroplasticity, right? How are we going to have those spaces where, 20 years ago, a university student might have gone, right, for my gap year, I'm going to go to Mongolia with $300 in a backpack and see what happens, And of course, there's still people who do that, right? So I'm not saying it's not a universal thing, but there's something very important about the story we tell as a culture about that being like, yeah, great, go for it, instead of safety focused.
So I want to come back to the story in a minute as we will look to land this with inquiring about the big story that you're tracking now. But just staying for a moment with this insight about, could it be that neuroplasticity is indeed activated by stress? Because another story parallel you were mapping earlier on Rebel Wisdom involved the parasympathetic awareness of the polyvagal theory, and that actually tells a story from the other side. No, you need to be engaged in safety to discover learning. And so how do you put these two conflicting stories one next to the other in your own mind?
That's a really good question. I don't know, actually. I don't know. It's a really good point. I hadn't really connected the two of those. I mean, in a way, I wonder if, you know what? I would just love to see research on that, right?
Well, let me offer an early hypothesis before the research, because let's just face it. The scientists tell us that it's all about the scientific method, but they follow what you described before. They have their intuitions and they shape their exploration this way. Well, could we actually map a larger loom of possibilities? The different conditions unlock what I will describe. I'm going to use a different term before I bring neuroplasticity. Different conditions will induce inner conductivity, heightened interior energized state, whereby we are unlocking creativity, innovation, both in terms of individually our own possibilities and with family members or team members and so on. Could we envision not just one or two, but so there is the most relaxed setting where we don't need to worry about anything, and that induces one threshold of discovery, one portal of discovery? Is there a second one which is stress, life-threatening kind of condition that it's to be or not to be, those Shakespearean moments in a life that unlock us to new possibility? And are there more? What about the playful scenario where we are in the playground of discovery? So I would, if this was going to be the project of my dissertation, I would look to map probably 5 different scenarios, each of which unlocks the inner conductivity, the neuroplasticity, the permission for innovation and creativity through different pathway, and recognize that we have different paths into these spaces.
It's a really interesting question, because what's coming up for me as an avenue is that there's a difference between stress, chronic stress put on an organism, which I think, does that also lead to neuroplasticity? I don't know. There's something about challenge and stress that are different, right? And I wonder if there's something around intentionality, which is very important, because there's a lot of, shamanic traditions that used physical duress or hunger or thirst in order to reframe and get new insights. So there's something in that. And even, in a lot of mythology. You know, Odin is kind of effectively crucified on a tree, you know, to get knowledge of the world, right? And so there's this kind of, there's something around intentionally going into an environment or a situation that challenges us. Even travel does that, right, in some way, right? As opposed to being kidnapped and brought somewhere, right? Which is a very different experience. So I would also be very curious about that, and about the level of intention, which is about psychological safety. So it would be like, yeah, is it different with psychological safety or not? The problem with that as a research is that getting ethics approval to put people in real sense of psychological fear would be difficult. Maybe not in the 1950s, but certainly now. Yeah.
Well, I know we are diverging on many fronts, but it's okay. It's part of the portal's nature, because what you offer there now invites us to research neuroplasticity in different contexts. So there is the transformational context. How do I reimagine the story of who I am and what I'm about? And there is the neuroplasticity of trying to come up with an innovative solution to a problem outside of me. These are different parts of the brain, but are they using similar or different thresholds to unleash those possibilities? Which brings me to maybe kind of final part of the exploration, because where you landed there, Ali, you said, well, it's your interest in the trauma piece was, so what is the bigger story? What is the bigger narrative that we are embracing at this time, individually and collectively? So say a little more of what is the narrative that you are exploring, and how it relates perhaps to the book you were working on, and what else is in you about this moment in time, this post-pandemic, still perhaps early stages of what may be a decade or 2 decades of major transformation. I'm already seeding my narrative a little bit, but what is your narrative into these times?
Yeah, so well, as I'm sure you've talked about in the portal, and you know, a lot of other people have pointed out, it's a time of great overlapping crises. And you know, crisis from the Greek means decision point, doesn't necessarily mean oh, there's nothing we can do. It's like, okay, we have to make huge decisions about who we are, what kind of society we're in, what we want to create. And so, I mean, the overall, my deep curiosity is what is going to emerge, because I think we are a complex system within complex systems. So what I'm particularly interested in, and what I'm tracking, is the birth and growth of new religious expressions in particular, right? Like, and spirit, like I think our only way out of the mess we're in is a shift on the level of ontology, of what we think reality is and what our place is in it. Because right now, overall, particularly in, you know, Western secular nations, the ontology that we're working with, the view of reality that we're working with, is reality is dead matter, stuff. You as a human being have consciousness as a strange fluke. It's not even real. We don't know what it is. We don't want to talk about it. It's not real. Don't worry about it. And of course, from that foundation, what makes sense is to consume everything until we're dead, because why would we do, you know, there's nothing else, there's nothing transcendent to it. So I think the return of the transcendent into culture is simultaneously the most important and most complex thing that I think is happening in some way. And it's happening in lots of different ways. And I think it's like a swirling ocean. And I think a lot of it's happening online. New religions are forming online. And I have a theory called the Age of Breach, that we're seeing these like proto-religions like QAnon, etc., forming online. They're symbolic, they're mythic, they erupt into the real world. They last sometimes a few days or whatnot. They fizzle out, and you know, and that is something I think is often overlooked when people are looking at systems change, for example, because they're trying to look at, you know, equally important. The game theory of our economic systems and incentives is also incredibly important. But what I'm very interested in is what's happening in the depths, under the surface, in the psyche, in the collective unconscious and the collective psyche, which is really what tapping into the zeitgeist is getting this little piece of the collective unconscious and flowing with it. So that's what I'm most fascinated by. And I suspect we will see more religions emerging, because it's almost like a response to the meaning crisis, to the emptiness of consumer culture. I just read a great book about quantum gravity, you know, and what's fascinating about that is that, you know, we know, or we're close to knowing, or we have a pretty good idea that the universe is deeply relational and flowing and, you know, pretty Taoist. And, you know, it didn't talk about consciousness, but that's what I'm particularly interested in terms of quantum physics. So in some way, the science is changing, but the cultural story is still stuck somewhere in the science of the 1950s, right? And so I'm really interested in how science and spirituality can start to coalesce in new ways that also meet the socioeconomic challenges that we have and are going to have, and the geopolitical challenges, which are going to probably get more extreme. So that fascinates me, and I'm very curious to see what happens. And my hope is that enough of us and enough people have a deep longing to direct that process in a way that's good for humanity and all of us.
So your core impulse, your core passion is this transformation, tracking that transformation, decoding that transformation, participating and facilitating that transformation through storytelling. And you are sensing that, yes, the system has a part to play, but you're even more interested in the interior and how the unlocking of the interior and the individual, but your focus is even more so the collective interior, the stories, the myth, and within that you're tracking the arising of what presents itself as religion in this postmodern, metamodern time. This is a beautiful inquiry and passion, and it's been an exhilarating conversation with you, Ali. I'm excited that we finally got to do this.
Yeah, likewise, Aviv. Thank you. This was, as always, brilliant and fascinating to talk to you, and yeah, a lot of new ideas actually forming for me and new angles. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.